Okay, so today I am very happy to have a conversation partner, one of my most favorite YouTube channels that I've discovered recently. Speaking with Magpie from the channel Reading is a Skill, and just lots of great, interesting books and ideas that come out of his channel. And so I guess the first thing, just maybe well, there's some similarities in our backgrounds. We both grew up in Massachusetts and have now moved to Texas. Come kind of different parts of the state both times, and also have come to a little bit of a later in life understanding with some of this kind of neurodivergent stuff. And I believe you had the ASD component diagnosed first and then found out about ADHD, and I was the other way around. So yeah, just why don't you just tell me a little bit about like what you are doing with your channel and how and the thought process of what this kind of idea space that you're exploring.
So explained this a few times now, so I'm getting better at not elevator pitching it yet, but right. The original idea for the channel came 2019. So the end of 2018, I learned about basically how the government had put its thumbs hard on the scales of dietary science, lied about it, and consequently, I tried to eat healthier, gained 180 pounds extra, which was a big issue to me. And I'd always sort of assumed, like, up until that point, that like I knew, like in like social science, there was a lot of bad like theories that held on, but I assumed it was because it didn't matter, and I assumed if it mattered, we'd get better, our knowledge would get better over time. And I realized we actually knew, like, certainly that obesity was caused by starch and sugar, and then we decided it was caused by fat because fat has more calories. But that was after we decided heart disease was caused by fat based on, anyway, so I was like, okay, so this is telling me like my assumptions on how I could determine what was true were wrong. And then I realized, like, I started thinking about how do we approach science, and I realized it's like we have a tendency, we look for what is easy to research, and then we try to draw a conclusion from that, as opposed to asking what actually matters and what are the best conclusions we can draw from that, which I think is exactly backwards in terms of what we should be doing. And so it's like, okay, I was unemployed again back then. And I was like thinking, okay, well, I've been unemployed for a while, and if I can make like a YouTube channel or something work, and I had 3 ideas, 2 of which I had ideas of how to possibly tie in merchandise early. And then this one, which I was going to call Leaving the Lamppost, I didn't. But I was like, but I still wanted to talk about this. And then I got a job. And so I was sort of thinking about it, wasn't really pursuing it until I had an idea for a publish or a startup that I wanted to try to kickstart. I was like, well, I don't have the audience that I could get this Kickstarter, but if maybe I could build this as a booktube channel. And so, and then I got laid off again, and I'm like, okay, now I've realized, like, as an autistic person with a weird resume, it's very hard to get a 9-to-5 job, and I can keep it well enough when I get it, but it tends to burn me out unless I have certain accommodations. And so it doesn't really seem sustainable. And so even though it's going to be the harder thing to do, I should try to figure out self-employment. And I still have these questions in my mind about how do we know what we know? How do we figure all this out, right? And so I was like, well, maybe I can do this channel idea as a booktube channel. And so that's sort of what that idea came out of, basically, was me. Initially, I was thinking I was going to try to kickstart this project. And then by the time I was doing daily videos, I found out that I was scooped on this particular idea by a team of 9 experienced people. And I'm like, okay, but like, I still think I could have, if I, planned it out and outsourced like the stories once I'd written them, I could have done this with me and a few like contractors instead of 9 people. Just would have taken longer, but so I'm like, okay, so I was onto something there. So I can probably find another business idea, but I need to figure out, like, I'm good at coming up with ideas, like that's the easy part, but how do I test what is going to actually be something I can do it with? And so the channel is sort of simultaneously me exploring a lot of these questions, initially about how we know what we know, although I've sort of expanded to other topics that interest me too. And then also at the same time, it's me trying to figure out what can I do that's going to make me sort of money, sort of sustainably self-employed, and I'm realizing, do you know about the idea of the managerial revolution?
Yes.
So I'm realizing basically we've seen like an increase in James Scott's book, Seeing Like a State?
I don't know.
Okay. No. Well, that book, he basically talks about this idea of legibility, where basically he talks about states, but it's any like mass institution. They care less about outcomes, like getting the best outcomes possible, than they do about predictability and the feeling of being in control and feeling like they know what they know. Mm-hmm. So as the managerial revolution has happened, as these institutions have gotten bigger, they select more for predictability and for the illusion of knowledge. And so they don't know what to do with someone like me. And like more and more, like, and it's interesting because like 70 years ago, I would have been a good fit for academia. And then academia became managerialized. And now I'm not a good fit, but I was still, there were like 9-to-5 jobs that hired people like me. But I'm realizing like most people I relate to, either they started their own companies or they got a job at a small company where they sort of filled a unique role that people understood what they did. But almost all those people are Gen X or older. So I'm like, this managerialist logic of we need you to be predictable is sort of creeping like downwards to like, or it's covering more and more space. And so it's going to be harder to make like a living for someone like me in any working for anyone sort of influenced by managerial institutions. So I've been trying to figure out just how to make self-employment work. So that's sort of been the two sort of ideas behind my channel, basically.
Yes, those are, you know, things that are near and dear to my heart, especially kind of trying to figure out a lot of the more sustainable aspects of a work and career thing. And, you know, it's like I kind of I realized like, so when I found out that I had the ASD component, you know, I realized, oh, I had locked myself into a job situation that was mostly very beneficial for my lifestyle or whatever, because I work by myself most of the time. I have a lot of freedom in what I can do, and I can listen to things all day long, and more or less, if my work gets done, everybody's happy, and I don't have to talk to people. And realizing like, oh yeah, well that makes sense. Yeah. Now, some of the other what essentially happened is getting married, buying a house, having children. The complexity of life just kind of got more to where I could handle, and I was starting to realize my coping skills are not, you know, not up to snuff, and kind of there was always some certain aspects of my life where I was like, this seems like it's really hard for me and not nearly as hard for everybody else, and I don't understand why. So, you know, that sent me down a kind of the same path of discovery of trying to figure out the ideas behind things, and a lot of that, you know, epistemological kind of things, and a lot of worldview stuff. And I come from a Christian background, and still hold to that, but realize like in general, like most churches are not doing a very sufficient job of addressing those questions. You know, it's become a thing that is maybe addressing that spiritual component of a person's life, but you know, if you contrast it with like Judaism, which draws on the same source material, that's a religion that's very much has something to say about all aspects of life. And you know, you know, there's it's bringing up these questions naturally in a way that, you know, most churches and Christian communities weren't. So yeah, so that sent me down a lot of rabbit trails. So one of the things I really liked about your channel, though, is that there's certainly some authors that I'm familiar with, and especially, you know, like C.S. Lewis and G.K. Chesterton, which are very big in the Christian sphere, and then other ones like Thomas Sowell and Michael Polanyi, which you've gotten into recently a little bit more, and I had some familiar with him from other people, and you know, but what is really interesting is that you have read a lot of books that I haven't read, which have given you a vocabulary for concepts that I've encountered, but just, you know, and I'm really fascinated by that, that way that, you know, you can really, there's a lot more similarity between maybe different schools of thought, or there's different ways of arriving at a similar, maybe holistic worldview, but you will have different language and you'll get different vocabulary that brings you to that same place. So I mean, I don't know how to say what the question is, but maybe, well, maybe for an example, like, you recently had the video. Yes. So this was the topic that I was getting at there. So you kind of talked about this idea of like reading backwards and how that kind of led you, it's kind of like hyperlinking, I guess, from book to book or whatever. But maybe you can explain that and how that's kind of helped you figure out some of this stuff.
Yeah, well, so that gets to you've probably seen my second most popular video on frameworks sort of help determine what facts you can learn. And that's something I've done for a long time. And I realized one thing is I probably have synesthesia, which I never even thought about until Nassim Nicholas Taleb said he did it. So Nassim Nicholas Taleb said he did. And then I was talking with a friend who was talking about, how with like movies and TV shows, so the crazy people, the geniuses and the crazy geniuses, they have like a vision board that they're rearranging things in front of them. And I just like, nobody thinks like that. And I'm like, I think like that. Like I'm not rearranging it with my hands, but it's pretty close to like how I'm sort of imagining things. And I realized like there are similarities with sort of the way that professional like memorizers do their memory palaces, except that for me, it's fluid, rather dynamic rather than static. And so stuff like I learned something and it rearranges like the relationship, everything else. And one thing I've kind of wondered, and this is, so I'm generally hesitant to talk about IQ because it's a loaded issue. But it is like, it's clear to me, like most of what is in IQ sort of tests is ability to sort of do like pattern matching and sort of high level abstraction, both of which are things that I'm really good at. So I actually don't know what my IQ is because I have a combination of 80th percentile working memory, 5th percentile processing speed, and then the ceiling effect. And so basically you can look at whatever the ceiling effect is for the stuff that's not processing speed or working memory, how much that is, and that's what I'll get on a given IQ test. But that comes at a cost of the social skills that humans evolved for. I am really bad at those. I am face blind, and I didn't believe I was because I met people who are more face blind. But I've realized talking to a friend, like I see faces as objects, and I've gotten better at like recognizing faces as distinct objects. But I still depend a lot on context. And like if I ran into you at the supermarket, I would have no idea who you are until you introduce yourself because I would not recognize your face. You'd just be a bald, bearded guy out of context. And I also, the other thing I realized is I'm basically blind to like status until at least using system 1 thinking, and then if I use system 2. And so I've been skeptical of the idea that you should see differences I was like, if you would see differences between groups in IQ, you should see differences in group size, because I believe in the social intelligence hypothesis. And so I was like, but you don't. And so Dunbar's number is pretty consistent. And so one thing I kind of think is, at least for me, what's going on is instead of using those slots that I'm supposed to be using to keep track of people and their relations, I'm using them to keep track of ideas. And so it's, I think a little bit of that would benefit me. A lot of it has sort of been not a good thing, but my whole life I've been like, I think about, as long as I can remember, I've thought about things in terms of like frameworks and different ways of ideas relating to each other. And I've sort of gotten more explicit in that. And you do see, because generally you don't see people ever inventing the exact same idea twice, but you'll often see it like very close parallels sort of serving the same function. And so one thing, and I'm not a Christian, but I don't know if you read my article on the Trinity on my blog.
I don't know if I've seen that one, but I will. But
basically, like for a long time, I thought the Trinity was one of the most ridiculous things about Christian orthodoxy. And then I realized I see these patterns come up again and again of you sort of, and so you see it with Arthur Koestler, with holons, with holarchy of you have the self-assertive principle facing down and the self-transcending principle facing up, or you see it with Sigmund Freud, which I realized he basically sort of cribbed from Plato there, but still you have the id or the passions, the reason or the superego, and then the ego comes from mediating between them. You have Martin Buber, where I can only exist in relation to I, thou, or I, it. And all of these things basically sort of seem to have this dynamic of you have these sort of two sort of directions, sort of intentions in tension, which create the idea of self. And I realized, like, if you think about the traditional Christian idea of the Trinity, where it is well, depending on if you're Orthodox or Western Christian, with Western Christianity, the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son, which sounds very similar to this idea of the ego, like, resulting from the sort of conflict between the id and the superego, or the holons, like the idea of sort of the holon's identity, self-transcending versus self-effacing, or Martin Buber, the I-thou, I-it relation, and I comes from sort of the contrast between those two relations. And I've been watching, I don't know, do you know the channel Apologetic Squared?
I don't, not off the top of my head.
He's the smallest channel, but he does, like, his whole thing is he's trying to do like Bayesian arguments for God and Christianity. And I realized, like, in a Bayesian sense, I now think, sort of looking at this, my understanding of the Trinity is an argument for Christian orthodoxy. Again, I still don't believe, otherwise I don't believe in Christianity, but I've gone from, oh, this is a weird thing I don't understand, this actually makes a lot of sense. And I forget how I was, oh, right, because I was talking about, so you have these, so Freud is a little bit orthogonal to the other ideas because the passions and the reason are a different dichotomy than the sort of the trying to assert yourself with agency versus trying to connect with others, sort of subsume yourself through communion, that the other three, so I mentioned Kostler, Buber, and one other person who I'm blanking on right now, all sort of had. But you do see these sort of parallel concepts arise again and again that have often very similar functions, even if they have sort of different origins. And I mean, I talked about, my second most recent video was the map territory distinction. And I think one thing I've always been good at, and I've been fascinated by like actual physical maps since I was in elementary school, but I've also like realized maps as metaphors, like these frameworks. And it's mostly been since about 2018 that I've really started to, like, I've had a tendency towards perspectivism and interest in these frameworks, but it's really only since about 2018 that I've really started to think about, oh, the way people think about these things represents a coherent framework. And if people are saying something that sounds stupid to me or incoherent, it's because I'm not understanding it. And there's different levels of understanding, because there's typically the level that people will understand things in terms of like what they will say explicitly. And then there's their sort of their own intuitions, which they might not be able to express. And then there's also the function that it will serve, because often if something sort of serves your interest, even if it goes against what you say you want, people will sort of tend to justify it. So you have at least like sort of three different levels in which people will have these operational frameworks, and really understanding where people are coming from typically requires understanding at least two of them, I'd say, but ideally all three. So sorry, I don't know how much that was answer your question, but.
Well, it's fine. We can talk about that. Was like the next thing on there was the map territory thing, which that is the one story from Borges, that one little paragraph that I did read. So, and I know you read much more of him, but that topic about the map and the territory has been something I've been thinking about for a long time now, or recently in a long time. So I have a friend named Daniel Garner. Him and his wife write under the name OG Rose, and they have a YouTube channel, and they've put out like 10 books.
I've seen some of their books, like Amazon has recommended their books to me.
Yeah. So his book called The Map is Indestructible, and it's it's on the problem of internally consistent systems. And once I connected with him, I realized, like, okay, so my thinking about things has resulted in one very thick book, and then a little bit more, a little bit skinnier one that, but just try, mostly of essays trying to cover some of these things, but it was kind of like trying to figure out. Like, I mean, I guess it kind of explains the tribal dynamic in a sense, essentially, in that people have an internally consistent worldview, and that's their map, they're essentially, and that it actually acts as a filter to keep out the territory, or it protects you from so Daniel articulated it as like so he calls it the indestructible map, and then there's like techniques of map sealing, which is basically the ways that people justify the argument, their rejection of arguments that question their assumptions, or map vanishing, which is just where, you know, these things are just invisible to people. Like, people are just completely unaware of their assumptions. And he actually kind of goes through Gödel's incompleteness theorem, and that essentially the only way to kind of, you have to have some sort of thing that brings you to the end of your logical explanations, you know, and then you might have to end up having some kind of a breakdown or something, you know, some event, some catastrophe that kind of shakes you out of your stupor and causes you to realize that you have been viewing life through a particular lens. But it's very apparent because, you know, if you look online, like especially like in the Christian space of like Catholics and Protestants or something, they will just go back and forth, each sending each other the same like 4 Bible verses again and again, not realizing that they just, what pops out to them as obvious speaks something very different to the other tribe. But because they have all of a shared vocabulary, they just can't communicate because everything means something different.
Yeah.
So so, and I guess, you know, so I guess maybe this is one of the things that you encounter more as like a neurodivergent person in dealing with this, is that to function well, you maybe have to become more aware of the fact that other people are operating in these maps.
Yeah. So something that I've seen a lot of people observe is that neurodivergent people seem to either be really good at perspectivism or really prone to black and white thinking. And I think what I realized it actually is on any given issue, neurodivergent people tend to be either really prone to black and white thinking or really good at perspectivism. And with time, like, I was much more prone to black and white thinking as a kid, but I had these perspectivist tendencies that have grown with time. And I know someone else, for example, who was absolutely, I never saw any sign of perspectivism I knew him when he was in his early 20s, and now he's like in his early 30s, and he is like, actually, he still tends to black and white thinking, but he'll have flashes of like really perspectivism that most people I meet won't be able to sort of get. And so I think it is because we sort of have a tendency to be like, I don't see how it could be different. And then we sort of pick at it, and then we realize, oh, this is how it could be different. And once we do, we have sort of access to that in a way that other people don't. And like, any worldview like has a whole bunch of assumptions like behind it. And that's in my framework study. One of the things I pointed out is people tend to assume that a given set of facts can like get you to a given conclusion, but it only works if you have sort of the same operating system, the same framework for processing those facts, which I probably didn't understand when I was younger, but I've certainly understood it basically my entire adult life. And so you're talking about the Catholic Protestant sort of debates, and I've seen this a bit in because I watch a number of Christian channels, and so I've seen this in occasionally people, you know, channel Redeemed Zoomer.
Yeah.
I'll see like people pop in sometimes and like give him like sort of their heavy-handed, usually Catholic talking points that are like he's already addressed in his video, sort of talking past him. And I will, so I wrote an article on my blog about my sort of new understanding of what it means for a conversation to be in bad faith, because I initially thought like bad faith was insincere, but I realized like there is this, most people when they try to engage have specific talking points they want to push on you. And my channel, it's less common because I tend to attract people more like me, but it's still common. But on a lot of channels, like it is the dominant thing is people will sort of try, and you have like a lot of books that'll point this out, is people don't want to be sold to, people want to buy from you. But people still have a tendency to think, okay, I have this idea and it works for me and I need to sell this to other people. And I actually, one of the early booktube channels that I followed a lot was this, she's a Christian, but she also sometimes does other like classics and also YA fantasy, which is generally of less interest to me. Rebecca Smith, I don't know if you've seen any of her stuff.
I might have.
But and so I like
more, I'm more name blind than face blind.
Yeah.
So
I like a lot of her videos, although like when it's specifically on like if it's on Christian stuff and it's not on C.S. Lewis, I'm not really interested, but I'm interested in her videos on classics or on reading in general. And I've left comments on her videos, and I've sort of given up on that because while I like her videos, the people in her comment section are all like, she is clearly very much from an evangelical, sort of Southern evangelical background, and most of the people on her video are too. And they will, if I say, like, I'm acknowledging, like, I can, on Apologetics Squared or as Dean Zoomer, I can talk about my own views, like, as a non-Christian who's interested in Christianity, and people are generally, they're buying, not selling. They're like trying to understand where I'm coming from for the most part. And even, I don't know if you know the channel Ready to Harvest.
Yes.
I posted at least a couple times there, and I've had a few people try to sell, but it's mostly been people genuinely engaging with me. But on her channel, it's all people, these sort of Southern evangelical Protestants who can't imagine anyone else with a different view. And they're like, well, why don't you just go read your Bible and then you'll find Jesus? And I'm like, no, that's not that worked for you because you came from a background where the only sort of idea of faith that you had was sort of this evangelical tradition. And so to the extent that you would have faith, it would have to be through Christianity. And so the Bible would work for you. And I don't come from that background. And so it's interesting. I spend a lot of time trying to work out when I see people who are doing this selling now, like, what is it that's motivating them to try to, because there's obviously something, they're like, I have this feeling like that I want to share, and it can be both positive and negative. So it can be both, like the people wanting to share their religion or their politics, which, I mean, it's annoying, but it's positive in the sense it's like, I believe this is important, but it can also be like antinatalism. And I grew up, like, I very much internalized antinatalist assumptions because I grew up with a sort of essentially what I describe as a Calvinist version of feminism and a Calvinist version of environmentalism. And both of those very much sort of implicitly point to you shouldn't have biological kids. And I had to sort of unpack and sort of unprogram myself from that and get past that before I realized it was okay to want kids. And I realized a lot of my life was sort of in denial about that because I just internalized this deeply. And I realized a lot of people either with sort of, I was sort of unusual because I was in a rural area, but heavily like culturally Calvinist. But then you also, urban areas, you see a lot of this too. And so especially like neurodivergent people. And I was talking to someone who's like, I think like intelligent, conscientious, neurodivergent people who sort of internalize the culture that we get, which is very big on feminism and environmentalism, ends up being sort of implicitly coming to this conclusion of antinatalism because inherently, like, you cannot have perfect equality between men and women if you're going to be having kids. It's just not going to work. And you can have like an equal relationship, right? But you can't have like perfect, identical, like symmetry, sort of like the, Brave New World, or like everyone's exactly identical, right? Once you bring kids in the picture, that's not possible. And that's why the Shakers, for example, which was founded by a woman pushing gender equality, banned having kids, or I think that's part of it. And have you been to Hancock Shaker Village, by the way, out of curiosity?
I have not.
Okay. Yeah, you're from Central Mass, right? So it's a bit more of a trip.
Yeah, a little east of Worcester. So
yes. Yeah, so
near
that's
Rhode Island.
Yes, because that's an hour and a half for me. So I had multiple school trips, but from you it would probably be like 2.5, 3 hours. And anyways, and then with that environmentalism, of course, it's there's overpopulation and resource consumption, and like, why would you want to bring kids into this? And so you have the positive and the negative, like pushing of these worldviews. And sometimes I can sort of understand where they're coming from. Like the antinatalists, I was there and I unprogrammed it. And then sometimes it's like, this is actually kind of an alien view to me, and I need to understand what's behind it. But I think, again, like I said, it's neurodivergent people, because we are used to not being understood. We'll either like be like, just, I don't understand, like black and white. I don't understand. This is frustrating that I keep running up against this. I don't understand it. Or we'll be like, okay, I need to start picking at this and understand it. And then we understand it. We end up understanding it with a lot more nuance than the average person who doesn't have to deal with that.
Yeah. That's, I don't know, have you seen the channel called Christianity on the Spectrum?
I think you recommended that one to me, but I haven't watched any of his videos.
It's interesting because he has surveyed like 26,000 people who are either currently or formerly Christian and are neurodivergent or whatever, mostly ASD1 or Asperger's kind of. There's definitely these tendencies, and it's not just in Christianity, it's, across all worldviews in some sense, where if it's kind of pitched as a neurotypical to the typical, the neurotypical audience, there's an assumption of like, well, people aren't going to really take this at face value. They're going to kind of see the nuance around it, and then it's the neurodivergent people that go all in, take everything as sincerely as possible, and then either they become a pariah because they're pointing out the inconsistencies that other people are doing, or they just burn out because it's nobody's else is trying to live that way, or so.
I mean, I've talked about that a bit with like feminism, where I was genuinely like, I believed in feminism as I was sort of taught that as it was good for both men and women. And then it took me a while to realize that conservatives are right when they say that most women who identify as feminists are operating on not even, is this good for women, just do I think this is good for me? And but I've also, like, political causes in general, I think that's why I identify with the left more, is because the left will tend to preach altruism and then sort of have a double standard. I mean, everyone is ultimately like, we're all hypocrites, but I think, and I was talking with a friend about this, I think neurodivergent people tend to have a harder time at self-deception for at least 3 reasons, which are, first of all, when we do something that is contradictory in a way that is not like standard for neurotypicals, they will make sure we know that we are contradicting ourselves, and they will hammer that home. Secondly, if we're like smarter, then we will pick up on, oh, like I'm seeing other people doing this, and then questioning, hey, am I doing the same thing too? And I've actually like overgeneralized this. Like for a long time, like I talked about, like I realized I actually am exceptional in the sense like I'm always the exception, but also hopefully like I can do great things, but I'm not there yet. But I was in denial about it because you meet so many, the term midwits?
Mm-hmm.
You meet so many midwits who all of them are convinced they are like the unrecognized genius of a generation, right? And so I met so many of those people. And so I'm like, well, if I think I'm actually like exceptional, capable of doing great things, these people who are clearly mediocre think they're capable of doing greater things than I am. So I must be even less capable than they are. And that was sort of the conclusion that I drew for a long time. So there's the ability to like do pattern recognition can sort of hamper us because we are more willing and more able to question, is what I'm doing actually effective? And it's sort of 2 related. Anne of Green Gables talks about, like, I make a lot of mistakes, but hopefully I'll run out of mistakes to make because I never make the same mistake twice. And interestingly, Jose Ortega y Gasset in Revolt of the Masses, like the way he defines a natural aristocrat is someone who is determined to never make the same mistake twice. And I think a lot of neurodivergent people have this tendency where we try to like not make the same mistake twice. So people won't let us have the self-deception that seems like contradictory to them. Or even in cases like I've realized some things that I've had were actually not self-deception, but they were incomprehensible to neurotypical people. And so I convinced myself I must be deluding myself. And I realized, no, I was actually deluding myself in the other direction. And then you have the tendency to try to actually like unpack, is this actually working? Am I actually achieving what I say I'm trying to achieve? That I think most neurotypical people aren't driven to. And then on top of that, we are disproportionately prone to depression. And depressed people, studies show, generally are not good at self-serving self-deception, like not in terms of inflating themselves up, which my hypothesis is that it's basically like in primate societies, depression exists to keep you from constantly challenging the top monkey. So if you challenge the top monkey a few times and lose, you're like, okay, I'm not capable of challenging the top monkey, and I'm just going to sort of stay back and away from things. That's sort of my hypothesis. And it doesn't really help so much in like the modern human society we have, but it's still there. And so between these 3 things of neurotypical people, if something seems contradictory to us, they will make sure we know it and they'll hammer it in. We have a tendency to ask, is this actually serving the end I want? And recognizing patterns and realizing stuff like what we're not actually achieving what we say we want to achieve. And depression making a lot of us worse at self-serving self-deception. We end up it ends up being, I mentioned by a friend of mine, like I think to function in the world, you need to be good at like a level of self-deception that I am not and you are not. And that is a big part of my impairment in the world is you need like a baseline level of self-deception, which there's a number of stories about Pandora's box, but one of the interesting, like, so she closes the box, right? And there's a story of there was one last thing left in there. And so the question is, I've heard it told as either hope was left in the box or foreboding was, and she opened it and hope came out, or she left it closed and foreboding did, or for like foreknowledge of what will happen. And I think about that in terms of like, I like the sort of foreknowledge one because it is, I think we fundamentally cannot operate without taking risks and gambles that are fundamentally stupid if you try to think about them rationally. And yet that is how we advance and learn and how we like move as a species. Like a lot of what I've learned has come from trying to do things that I was biting off more than I could chew, but I learned a lot in the process. But if I known that I was not going to achieve my goal when I set out, I would not have tried that. And that's, and getting better at predicting, will I be able to do this, has made me worse at actually pursuing these projects, which is something I need to figure out how to do. And then, so we were talking about, I forgot, I had one other thing I wanted to say with this, but I forget what it was now.
Okay. Well, yeah, I mean, it's all good. You know, it's interesting. You know, I wonder even like, you know, obviously there's certain like deficiencies that people, neurodivergent or autistic people have, and it's not the same. You know, people have different hyposensitivities and hypersensitivities to different things, and so but there but I've been increasingly wondering how much of the sort of typical way that like the autistic personality or whatever is portrayed is really more of a learned experience. You know, I feel that in many ways, like it's a, because you know, I see this with my oldest daughter, because well, my wife is not, she's probably she's definitely like ADHD, but not autistic. And she also processes things out loud. So she is saying things that for her, she needs to say them so that she can hear them and process them, which means it is not necessarily it is not a well thought out idea, which means that there's a lot of things that come out that maybe are contradictory or are confusing. And if they're confusing for me, they are certainly going to be confusing to an 8-year-old with a similar way of thinking, you know. And so I see like my daughter almost like in real time as it's happening, like beginning to grab onto like logical thinking and, you know, empirical facts about like, you said this at this time and then this happened, and so what you said wasn't true. And you know, and you know, fortunately it's like I'm trying to be the advocate and be like, well, she's not trying to be rude. She doesn't even know what like rude is. Like, this is very confusing, you know. But it's like you can almost see that it's like this is the pattern that starts to happen, and it's like, oh, look back to when I was a kid and realize like how much of this was, you know, because I think maybe in some ways, or at least in certain areas, neurodivergent people will have a greater intuition, a greater ability to grasp certain patterns or see discrepancies. But if you say that to an authority figure in the wrong way or whatever, it's you get chastised. You know, you're told that's rude or you shouldn't speak that way, and then you get punished. And your reaction is, "Oh, I must have been wrong." And so then you learn to trust in the arguments that you can present with evidence in a logical way, rather than, and you begin to doubt those intuitions. And
and it is like language just can never convey intuitions, and this is a topic that I've had a number of conversations on. And you will probably get this because you're Christian, but I've noticed most people who are not Christian, I've had this conversation with, don't, like, I'm weird in being a Christian, non-Christian who gets this, but it's also, I'm still religious, even if I'm not, and so maybe it's being religious and I mostly meet Christians, but regardless, which is that there is intuition is distinct from both our like conscious explicit reason and from our emotions. But the English language, as Idris Shah has pointed out, tends to treat intuition and like emotions and like knee-jerk reactions as all being the same thing. And I'll have this conversation, and most people, again, who are not religious will be like, no, it's very clear. Like, how could you even have intuition separate from emotions? And I'm like, because it's an understanding It's a reason developed through experience that is much more complicated than what our language can articulate, but it's also like it's driven by like observations and understanding and not just, immediate emotion reactions. Intuition is a slow process, whereas like your knee-jerk gut reaction or your emotional reaction is a fast process. And what you're talking about also with your daughter, like this is one thing I realized is we have so much of our interactions are basically just primate dominant stuff that we dress up and find excuses for. And so it is the case that like authorities tend to not like being challenged when they're wrong, especially. And it's funny because it's always like the worst teachers I had were always the ones who most hated being corrected. And that's the thing is, if you are open to being corrected and being, I could be wrong, you're going to get better at your understanding. Whereas if you're like, no, I'm right, and I have the credentials, and like, that's when you're more likely to, you have a harder time learning. And so you never get better, but it's a harder thing because it means both a short-term sort of concession of status to other people, which to neurotypical people who are like good at seeing status, they don't want to do. And it also means like longer term, you're always going to be, because you're the one who can always admit like, I'm wrong, I don't know this, you're always going to be lower status than the person who can confidently be like, I don't know this. And I've been thinking recently about Sigmund Freud, because I was like taught like growing up, because I looked at it and I'm like, this all seems like BS. Like, and then I was taught, no, Sigmund Freud was actually really important to psychology. And then have you heard of Thomas Shaw's or Karl Kraus?
Not enough to know their deal.
So Karl Kraus was a Czech Jewish, like Austrian journalist who, and sort of commentator pundit, and he had a publication, Die Fackel, Die Torch, that was heavily influential in Germany, and he's still well known in Germany, but he's barely known in the English-speaking world. And a big part of that is, so Sigmund Freud was initially a fan of Kraus, and then Kraus was skeptical of both psychiatry in general, but psychoanalysis in particular, which he described as being a Jewish disease for Jews who were too rich for diabetes. And so even though Kraus himself was Jewish, like a lot of the Freud's defenders have tried to portray him as, oh, he was anti-Semitic, when he was just actually like saying a lot of Freud's, like it was people who were into psychoanalysis were mostly ethnically Jewish, and it seems to maybe have been influenced by Jewish religion or mysticism. I'm not quite clear on that, but the point is, so because Kraus was somewhat critical of Freud and rejected Freud, the Freud supporters basically tried to bury his reputation after he died. And I realized, like, reading about Thomas Shaw's, so Thomas Shaw's was a Hungarian psychiatrist who was critical of psychiatry. He's controversial because he teamed up with the Scientologists to try to fight psychiatry, which is kind of like trying to fight fire with napalm, right? But he like, his books are interesting, and so he was like, I want to bring Kraus's writing on psychiatry to an English-speaking audience. And so you realize, like, Freud, part of the reason I think he has been so successful is because he would never admit he was wrong. He was always, and in fact, his theories were designed to be unfalsifiable. They were designed, the idea of a Kafka trap?
I've heard that term, but go ahead and explain it.
So a Kafka trap is a situation you set up where anything you can try to do to discredit it it proves it. And so psychoanalysis, anything you do to try to contradict psychoanalysis proves that you are just so deeply repressed you can't admit psychoanalysis is true. So psychoanalysis isn't just unfalsifiable, it is deliberately anti-falsifiable, it's a very cultish thinking, and yet it has worked, and it has made Freud like one of the most important intellectual figures of our time, and I think dramatically more overrated than I think he deserves to be. Whereas like people will put him in fact like on a level with Marx and Darwin, or Freud put himself on a level with Darwin and Galileo, which, interesting, Galileo, similar thing, he was like, his issue, he wasn't prosecuted for saying the Earth revolved around the sun. He was prosecuted for saying you'd have to be an idiot for thinking that the Earth that any explanation aside from the Earth revolving around the sun could be the correct one, which was after, and so again, there's this degree of like extreme self-confidence ends up in sort of imperviousness to admitting you might be wrong, does, I think, serve the people who are capable of convincing people of it. And it's how you get sort of cult leaders for the people who are capable of doing it. But sorry, I'm going off on
yeah. Well, that's just so that's the perfect example of what OG Rose, he calls that map ceiling. So it's that thing of like the Kafka trap or whatever, or it's a means by where anybody who's going to raise criticism is actually reinforcing your arguments by attacking it. Kind of a persecution complex kind of thing comes from that too. Let's see. So you also on your it was in the same map one. You kind of brought up the spiral dynamics thing, which I've heard a lot of other people talk about. I have not read the book yet or read too much into it, but but so interestingly enough, I was curious about it, and I took some of my recent writing, a very large writing project I'm working on. I just put it into Grok and said, like, what's the spiral dynamic colors levels of this work? And it said it was yellow approaching onto turquoise. So I thought, okay, this is pretty good.
That would be, I was about to say, like, based on your blog, you come across as very yellow because, and like yellow is, and I didn't really try to explain this in the video. I realized, and I possibly should have, I didn't really try to explain yellow and turquoise because the thing is, when you explain them simply, people, especially people who are sort of high confidence in themselves, are like, oh yeah, I'm up there, I'm yellow, I'm turquoise, when they are clearly not. Although a lot of people who are at orange and most people who are green will be like, yeah, no, spiral dynamics just sounds like woo, like, and it's like, no, it really is. And my father introduced me to it. Well, he mentioned it, he told me about it back when I was at green, but I wasn't taking it seriously. I'm like, no, I'm as far as I could go, like intellectually. I can't see how you could like go morally beyond where I am. And because the way he was describing it, it sounded like second order thinking of the jump to yellow was a step back. It's like how, like acknowledging that like people at blue, for example, could, or especially red, could have something to say, could have something of value. Just, no, I couldn't imagine that. And then later, shortly before he died, I was talking with him about sort of what I was struggling with. And he was like, well, it sounds like you're sort of grasping at, what you were describing before was grasping at green, and now it's grasping at yellow. But I realized as I've understood it better, actually, I got to yellow on epistemology in around late 2018, early 19, but getting to yellow on morality was a lot harder for me, and I was a lot more resistant, and it took me until about 2022, just before my father died, but anyway, so, but what yellow ends up being is, it ends up being, you suddenly realize, oh, all of these ideas are valid in different ways. And so, like, when I was a kid, I understood sort of to some degree the logic of like young earth creationists, where it was, I'm like, okay, well, like their understanding of religion requires them to believe this, and it helped sort of keep the religious community together. But I was like, but that's dumb because it's wrong and it's keeping you from learning more about the real world. And then when I hit yellow, I'm like, no, it is like most people do not need to understand Darwinian evolution. And like, it is a small sacrifice to like to reject this framework that most people aren't going to need to have your community working. And that was something it took for me until to get to yellow to actually sort of get, oh, this can be valid. Like I could get why people might have this before, but I couldn't understand it being valid. I think that's a big part of, but the thing about yellow is there is this tendency, you want to explain, you want to account for everything. And so, because it's suddenly, you suddenly see this whole horizon, when you have this leap to second order thinking, it opens up of all this stuff I missed, and it's, you want to categorize it, you want to explain. And it's like looking at your blog, I'm like, you write very long blog posts, so you try to take everything into account, which I also did when I was at yellow. And one of the sort of things about, I think, getting to turquoise is realizing, oh, you just can't. And you need to try to get to the pith of the argument and not explain things more than you need to. But yeah, I would agree based on reading your blog, because you have this understanding seemingly of the perspectivism that other views are valid in coherent ways of the world, and the other levels too. Like there are times when red thinking is valid, there are times when blue thinking is valid. And that's one thing I've mentioned is like people often mistake yellow for blue. Like I'm realizing there were a lot of ideas that I realize now are yellow, but when I was at orange or green, I mistook for blue because I took the acknowledging of blue for yellow. And so like, are you familiar with PF, I think it's PF Jung, the YouTuber.
Yeah.
And so he's really into pre-Benzo Jordan Peterson. And I, like, growing up, like, or not growing up, but like when Peterson became popular, I was sort of seeing him presented through the left, and I was seeing him doing like a yellow presentation of blue, and I read him as blue. And then watching P.F. Jung, now that I'm past it, I'm like, oh no, he was actually not yellow, and in some of these things, like, he seems to be actually turquoise in what he's saying, but it looks blue because of like this acknowledging, when you're at green, you tend to think, oh, this very like moralistic, sort of simplistic approach of blue is something you've moved past, and you think you've moved past it for good. But anyway, sorry, yeah, spiral dynamics is interesting. It's also something that's kind of difficult to talk about because most people are not at yellow or turquoise, although there's a lot more now. And I think the pandemic pushed a lot of people there. Like, there are a lot of people I know who I think, as I mentioned, before the pandemic, I got there with epistemology, but I was stuck morally until after the pandemic. And I think I've seen, like, a lot of people seem to sort of have made that jump because of stuff related to the pandemic. But there's still, it's a minority of people. And people who haven't made that leap yet tend to either, if they're at green, a lot of people are going to be like, well, this is just, it's not, you can't like write a standard test that will test you for spiral dynamics levels. So it's like bullshit and it must be useless. So you can edit that out. I try not to swear because I know.
I don't care.
And
bullshit is from John Vervaeke. I learned that it was a proper, academic term. It's got a definition in psychology. So it's technical.
Or you have people who are at blue and orange and even red who will think that they are, oh, I am totally at second order. And then they'll try to have these conversations, not getting they aren't having it, but wanting to be included. And so it's something, because it is, I think, useful. And there's a lot of these developmental levels ideas, which are less controversial than spiral dynamics. The thing that I think makes spiral dynamics particularly controversial is that you have this idea of this break at second order thinking. And most of these sort of, they either don't acknowledge it explicitly or they basically stop at green. And so acknowledging that there are levels beyond this that sort of require this sort of perspectivist, like, step back leap ends up, it's controversial. And again, because it's either people want to argue, no, it's bullshit, or they want to be, oh, I'm totally at these higher levels. And it's not about, like, this is the case where self-deception isn't going to help you, because and this is the thing, is enough people recognize that it's going to be something, it's going to cease to be a tool, understandable, and it's going to be a status thing of, oh, I want to try to present myself as being the highest level I possibly can, just because anything that you can classify people as sort of a progression, people are going to want to be like at the end of that progression, right? They're going to want to be at the furthest they can be. But it is, at the same time, I think, having that distinction, plus again, having the agency communion distinction between the warm and the cool colors, which again, I am really frustrated that Ken Wilber, because almost everyone, my father found about it through Ken Wilber, my friend learned about it through Ken Wilber, I learned about it through my father, learned about it through Ken Wilber, and then I followed it back to the original book. Like, everyone learns about it through Ken Wilber, and Ken Wilber took out the warm color, cool color distinction, which is, in one of my actual first video in the consistent production schedule was talking about the agency communion distinction. These are the two fundamental human social motivations, and warm colors are agency, cool colors are communion. And having that, I think, is a really useful element. But anyways, yeah, so I've been wanting to read more of these other developmental level books too, particularly, have you heard of Evelyn Underhill's book, Mysticism?
No, it's called Mysticism?
Yeah, it's just called Mysticism. But it's considered like the definitive text on sort of the development of sort of people's understanding of like religious mysticism, particularly within Christianity, because that's what she was working in, but also it's seen as applying to other religions as well. And I've been meaning to read it. I do this thing with a lot of nonfiction where I read the introduction and first chapter to sort of understand where I can contextualize the book in relation to other things that I've read and when and how I might want to read it. And then it takes me a while to actually get to some of these books. I don't read at all, and some of them take me a while to actually get to reading them. So this one, I read the introduction and first chapter, but I've been meaning to come back to it. And I have others, but I do like the spiral dynamics because of the warm, cool color distinction and because of the explicit recognition of the second order thinking, which I realize really is a distinct phenomenon that a lot of these other developmental levels don't acknowledge explicitly. Although probably my second favorite developmental level thing that I've seen that sort of overlaps spiral dynamics was something my friend's therapist showed her that starts out, you know what you know what you don't know what you don't know, and you don't know what you know. And so basically on a spiral dynamics level, I'd say you know what you know is basically up to the start of orange, so it's through blue. And then you know what you don't know is orange, and then it's getting into green a little bit, and then green and early yellow becomes you don't know what you don't know, and then late yellow into turquoise starts to become when it's you don't know what you know. And it's, as someone who was just starting to push turquoise when my friend was sort of saying, my therapist showed this to me, she says, I'm at, you know what you don't know, is that right? I'm like, yeah, that sounds about right to me. And then I started thinking about it more, talking about it, and like that actually, because I was just starting to push at the you don't know what you know, that is the value of intuition, which we sort of really underestimate in our culture.
Yeah, I mean, so it's interesting now, and hearing now that seeing this distinction is meant to be there between those warm and cool colors, because so it's interesting. So my friend Daniel, OG Rose there again, once he's big on this social coordination mechanism, which, you know, he's to say like, oh, with capitalism and Adam Smith and all this, the markets function as a pricing coordinating mechanism, but what we don't have is a social coordinating mechanism, which he basically says we're beginning to develop as this sort of thing, what we're doing right now through people, you know, meeting online and having Zoom conversations or whatever. And, you know, that the algorithm are finding similarities for us, maybe that we can't explicitly look for. And so I was kind of taking that idea and thinking about, well, this is probably a good application for AI. On the one hand, because there's a horizontal access, which that's kind of the translation issue, to say like, okay, Protestants and Catholics or whatever have a lot of, you know, you would in theory very closely aligned, but because of the way that they use the same vocabulary, very difficult to communicate. But you know, and this is like even you know, because I don't tend to just react with the knee jerk when I see something that triggers me. Like, so on Twitter, you know, there's that little grok feature for all the tweets. So if I see something and I want, and it makes me react, I'll just ask grok, like, what are they trying to say? Because I'm guessing I'm not understanding it. And I'll be like, translate it into, you know, evangelical Christian terms or something. And then, you know, and then I can understand, oh yeah, I'm much more closely aligned with this person than I thought. Whereas if I had just gone in, you know, guns blazing with some comment, you know, nothing would have happened. But there's the potential that I could actually have a meaningful conversation with someone. So that's kind of the horizontal problem. But the vertical problem is more of this, you know, this experience that you go through of realizing you don't know what you don't know, and all those levels, you know. And I had kind of worked through it in my own way as just, you know, like you know, only our tribe is the right tribe, and then, you know, well, there's other tribes that are you know, allies or something, and then maybe like, so thinking in like in Christian terms, like, oh well, there are some real Christians in every tribe, but not all, you know, whatever. And then oh well, then there's some people who act like Christians outside the Christian tribes, and then, you know, kind of you keep going on this way, and then you realize like, well, you know, I guess it's very much similar to kind of going up the levels, as you would say, in those ways. So I kind of call it like, you know, it's the vertical axis, like as an XY axis, in social coordination. But the problem with that is that if you're thinking it's going to get you're going to get status from it, it's actually it's a worse problem, because the higher up you go, the less people there are to relate to. So,
but it's also becomes easy to just sort of, and so that what I'll see, and one of the reasons I'm worried is you'll see any YouTube video on spiral dynamics is full of people who are saying, yeah, I'm totally yellow, or I'm totally turquoise, or I'm totally coral. And I'm like, if you need to get validation in YouTube comments about this, I can pretty much guarantee you're probably blue. And the other thing is, like, one of the things that I think Ken Wilber maintained in spiral dynamics, but I don't know how clear he made it, is that you're not operating at the highest level you can all the time or in all ways. And I mentioned, like, I got to yellow in epistemology like right between the end of 2018, start of 2019. But it took me until 2022 before I got there in terms of my moral reasoning. So it took me another like 3.5 years to actually get there morally. But yeah, it is. But it becomes, it's sort of like, that's another reason I'm worried about talking about IQ is even like the lowest numbers I get are high enough that are going to sound sort of like faux and bragging, because that's something like IQ has become something. It was supposed to be initially a measure of you're developmentally delayed, and then it became, well, also you're maybe developmentally ahead, and now it's something that people either use, like say, hey, I have a high IQ, to brag about how smart they are, when they typically it's people with a moderate degree of success. People who are highly successful don't do it, and people who are unsuccessful, like I am, people are just going to say, well, if you're so smart, why are you such a failure, right? And so it's the people who are just somewhat smart who are then like sort of showing off by, yeah, I have an IQ of 130 or whatever. And I like think it would be the same thing with spiral dynamics, given what I see with people in YouTube comments, which is why I'm hesitant to. Whereas it's like, I'm like, no, it's not. It's a journey that you get to, but you're right, because it is harder to find people to, although I do think you can have useful conversations with people like at any level once you're at yellow, potentially, because you're realizing the value in these and realizing the value of, understanding like the best case for different versions of it. But it is still the people who like, it is definitely easier to have a lot of conversations once people have gone to second order thinking, and that is limited. And it's also often sort of, sorry, I forget where I was going with this, but the other thing, so what was I, so we were talking about like having grok, like what are these people, why do they think this? And I've done similar things with Copilot, except for me, it's been, I've stopped using Copilot because Microsoft now requires a login, which would be fine, except Microsoft is constantly logging me out. And I'm like, I don't want to keep logging into Microsoft to use Copilot. If it was like Google and it kept me logged in, it would be one thing, but like constantly logging me out. And so anyways, but when it was not behind a login, I was using Copilot a lot, and I would use it because I realized one of the things it's good at is it's good at perspectivism, especially for like common sort of normie views. And so I would make predictions myself about, okay, I'm seeing people saying this, why are they saying it? And then I would summarize, hey, like people are saying these things, what would the reasoning be behind it? And then sure enough, most of the time, Copilot would come up with predictions that were very close to what I was predicting they would say. And I'm like, okay. And so I've talked about, like, I think with AI, you basically have at least sort of 3 distinct mirrors. So one mirror is, or like 3 distinct ways you can use it sort of and verify, is it going to be useful? And so one of them is, I tell it my thinking and I try to get it to repeat my thinking back to me, which Copilot was good at. Now I'm using Google Gemini and it sucks at that. And then there's because most of the training data is normal people, for things normal people care about, getting perspectives, which again, Copilot is better than Gemini. And I think part of this is, like, people have complained that a lot of these models have a liberal bias. And I realized Gemini definitely does. Like, I was trying to, like, talking about misbehavior of a certain streamer that was very obviously Hassan Piker, and it guessed Asmongold. And because Asmongold is controversial, I'm like, oh, this is something you would only come up with if you had sort of a lot of left-leaning training data, because they hate Asmongold. So it's like, oh, if a streamer did a bad thing, it must be Asmongold, when the specific details were very clearly Hassan Piker. But anyways, but it does, at least Copilot was pretty good at like getting different like normie perspectives from a bunch of different angles. And I've heard also Claudebot is good at that as well. And then the third thing is, if it's a specific like narrowly technical thing, then most of the training data is going to be weird people like you or me. And so it's going to be, and if it's technical, you can verify it. And so you ask it and then you can verify it. And I found that it generally has about an 80% success rate, but it's sort of frustrating because it's like, it will, like, most of the time it will get it like fine on the first try. But then if it doesn't, it's very hard to get it to the right thing, and it will take like multiple tries to get it there. And then there was something else you mentioned too that I wanted to respond to, because you were talking about, I don't remember what it was. Sorry.
The vertical axis, it gets lonelier at the top. I mean, that's
but the horizontal axis you were talking about, and something about.
Yeah, so that was kind of my idea that, saying that you've read a lot of very different books than what I've read. There's a little bit of overlap, but the concepts are roughly much more overlap in the concepts than in the actual books or even the vocabulary. And so like that was even when I encountered my friend Daniel, it was like, I immediately was like, he's come up with a vocabulary for a lot of the concepts that I had worked out on my own. So that made it like very easy to connect. And so my thought is really, basically, and this is, I don't know if you've seen anything from Ilan Barinholtz. He has been writing about, I think he's actually like a psychologist or something, but he's been writing a lot about large language models and basically saying like, it's not so much like the question of about like, will they become conscious, but more so it's revealing that like our use of language is not necessarily makes us as unique as we think it does. Like language itself contains the properties to kind of function in this way that we perceive as an active intelligence, but basically, and what he kind of does is he shows like, okay, if you could take anybody's like language usage and basically convert all of the words to just numerical symbols or something, and then everybody has like kind of a signature based on the weight of the relationships between the words. So like, and that's more mapping onto their actual thinking and the concepts and the way their brain uses language more so than carrying the vocabulary data. So my thought was, well, if you could have AI kind of decode that either by somebody like uploading a lot of their own writing, or maybe like if you had them do an extensive amount of chatting, you could kind of find people who have a similar kind of mental map or fingerprint, and you could connect them and then not have to worry about like if they might speak a different language or they might come from a totally different background, and you can have the AI translate, so a mediator to kind of help people connect.
So I have you seen my blog post on why I think AI is basically slime molds in a Chinese room?
I think I did read it, but I don't know if I remember
basically,
it.
I think like, so about the early ELIZA models, right?
No.
So the early, like there were some of the earliest chatbots with the ELIZA model, which basically, so Rogerian psychotherapy is basically the therapist will take whatever you say and repeat it back as a question. So it's like, why are you X? Like, or how does X make you, why, how does, Y make you feel, right?
Right.
And so ELIZA was an early chatbot that basically was programmed to do that. And famously, there was like a janitor in one of these labs who was found had been talking to ELIZA for hours. And for a lot of people like that will work. And so you can get sort of very basic. And when I first learned about John Searle's Chinese room thought experiment, I was very skeptical. And it's interesting because so one of these autistic people I mentioned who is generally bad at perspectivism, but then sometimes has like flash of insights. He was talking about, well, the thing about the Chinese room experiment is it doesn't really matter. Like, yeah, you might not speak Chinese, but the person in the Chinese room plus the Chinese room speak Chinese. And you know about the Chinese room experiment, right?
Yes, yeah. Now I'm remembering the blog that I read it.
And so it seems to me like it is, the LLMs are very good at stringing phrases together in ways that other people have as sort of an averaging thing, but the underlying logic is still very basic. And it's interesting because I was asking Copilot like early on, like a lot of questions about emergent order and examples, and it really liked coming up with examples from slime molds. And I realized the way it's describing how slime molds work is very close to my understanding of how LLMs work. And so I think it is, and slime molds can show like incredible complexity without like a lot of the cognitive tools that we sort of expect. And sorry, can I take a couple of minutes? I'll be right back.
Yeah.
anyways, so yeah, so it is, my thinking is what we have now, because the models, as I understand it, underlying these models are still, it's basically based on artificial neural networks. And I thought it was still based on high-level vector models, but I've been told that actually even that is like missing from a lot of newer models. So it's basically, it's all stuff we've been using for 50 years, just with a lot more processing power and a lot more data and a lot more humans involved in like tweaking parameters. And so I remember you talked about using AI to distinguish these things. And I talked about, like earlier in this call, my, like I noticed, so you had both Martin Buber with the I thou and I it relation, and Arthur Koestler with the holons and the self-assertive versus the self-transcending tendencies represent agency and communion, and the idea of the ego arising from the like conflict between those. Whereas Sigmund Freud proposed the ego arose from the conflicts between the reason and the passions, which is a sort of different dichotomy. And so I was curious, and I tried to ask Copilot to come up with other examples of like agency communion distinction, possibly leading to, not even leading to like a third thing, just agency communion distinction. And almost all the examples it came up with were really bad. Like, as I mentioned, like the Freud one is orthogonal, so it's not the same thing, but that is still a better example than what it came up with. And I realized that because these models are basically averaging the data they have, it is good at high-level abstraction, but not at what I called high-level distinction. And it's interesting because there was someone who commented on some of my early blog posts, and I looked at their blog, and it looked very much like a completely AI written blog. And then I wrote a blog post on, oh, this is interesting that this person seems to have 4,000 subscribers with a very obviously AI written blog. They didn't comment since. So I wonder if there was a human involved at some level who was like reading and then having, because the comments sounded AI, but and was offended, but it definitely, anyway, but to me, like, and so there's limits to what AI can do, which it's still impressive enough to most people because most people don't really think about it. And also because they don't realize how much older models could do to sort of fool most people. Like I never like would have a conversation with like AI where I feel like I'm actually talking to a person. I've had cases where it has sometimes seemed to have impressive insight, but it's generally been in cases of it can follow my reasoning once I set it up, which is still like, I think because again, the training data for these kinds of things are sparse, and people like me, even if it's not like the logic of normal people, it's still like enough logic of other people that can follow it. And so I think that would be a neat use, but I don't think it's going to be possible with current models. And it's interesting. Are you familiar with the channel Based Camp with Simone and Malcolm Collins?
Yes, I love them.
Yeah,
I haven't watched them in a long time, but I love them. I think
they have probably been my most consistently overlapped channel since I've had channel analytics available, which I'm like, that kind of makes sense because I have sort of a similar journey of Simone of being like, not urban monoculture, but still that kind of programming that I've had to unprogram with regards to antinatalism. And Malcolm has a similar interest in like a wide range of topics that I do. But anyways, their most recent video today was they're arguing for we should like be using like more AI like friends and companions. And I'm like, I think this is a terrible, so there's two things. So one thing is I think that's a terrible idea because it's, Jean, oh, you watched my levels, my frameworks. So you watched the video? You watched my map for stereo video. So you know about Jean Baudrillard and the levels of simulacra, at least, because even if you didn't know before you saw that video. And so it's sort of become a meme because a lot of what we have in society is, I think, past second order simulacra, it's something we should really avoid. Like there's value to like first order and second order simulacra, but beyond that, like maps are good. Maps of maps are good. Once we get to maps of maps of maps and maps of maps of maps of maps, I think we should be trying to take a step back. And so I don't think it's like mentally, emotionally, I do think it is, there are elements where talking to AI is helpful, but you need to be cognizant of the fact that it is AI and it's not a human. And it has been helpful to me, or it was helpful to me to Copilot, where I would see people doing frustrating things and I'd be like, I think this is why they're doing it, but it's like, it's still frustrating to me. And so I would complain, and then Copilot would be like, yeah, I think it's why it's okay. I'm like, I understand why they're doing it. I'm still annoyed, but it makes me less annoyed. And I am sort of living up to, a friend was sharing a meme where it was like, I think it's a click hole. So Onion's like, short form content thing. The good news, like you are using AI just enough that it's not going to make you psychotic, right? Or whatever. I'm like, yeah, that's kind of been my thinking, is the way I'm using it. Like, but I also especially since I've been using Copilot, I've been using a lot, but I don't think substituting human relationships for AI would be healthy. And it's interesting because they've been critical of other, like Malcolm has been highly critical of video games, which I think there's some value of some video games, but like, I agree with him that once it becomes your main hobby, that's a problem. Like your hobby should not be something that is pure sort of simulacra of like power fantasy, basically. And so it's interesting that he recognizes that there, but not for like AI friends and romantic partners. But also he was like, well, it's pretty like, he was talking about AI alignment concerns, and he was talking about like, well, what we've seen is AI actually thinks a lot like humans because it's an averaging thing. And I'm like, yeah, AI does because it's an averaging thing, but it's not because it's thinking like humans. It's because it's a slime mold like level thinking, averaging out what humans are saying. And I don't share like the concerns about AI alignment because I don't think we are likely to actually be able to build an AI that would actually, I don't think we're gonna be able to build an actual super intelligent AI. For a number of reasons, both sort of based on past observed behavior and based on the theoretical, both. So in terms of Kostler's hierarchy, both Friedrich Hayek and Ted Kaczynski have argued that you cannot understand like levels of complexity sort of above you. And I think our own cognition sort of, even though it is us, I think it sort of falls into that. And certainly in terms of social interaction, but it's like, I actually agree with him that it's like, yeah, I'm not concerned about alignment at all because, and it is in part because it is an averaging thing, but I disagree that it actually thinks like humans. I do think it is basically slime mold logic of selected human sort of import. And I also disagree that I really do not think we should be encouraging people to try to have peer relationships with AI models. Anyway.
Yeah, so it's interesting because I had avoided using all of it, just because I was like, I don't know, maybe it's funny. Like I tend to be in more like right wing ish or conservative ish groups. Like I only say like where I go when I go to church, it's like I would rather I'd rather go to a liberal church if they actually believed in God, but they don't. So I go to the conservative church and just put up with the small-mindedness of some of their superstitions or whatever. So whatever. I was not an early adopter or whatever. But I started first started using it after I wrote this book. So and to start feeding it in, like 800-page book. And and at first being very impressed by it would summarize the chapters. I would try to get it to see if it's like how is it understanding or the argument as the arguments build on each other from chapter to chapter, and I was impressed. And then at a certain point, it starts hallucinating or whatever, and then I realized it's just and there's different programs now. So now the one I use the most is now the recently rebranded Gemini Notebook, but Notebook LM, because that one it only goes off the sources that you put into it. So it's very useful in that way. It's not bringing in random like Reddit slop or whatever. But I realized this is impressive what it can do, but it's like any actual person that read the book would be able to hold the whole book in their brain in a way that this chatbot never really can. Because even if it's got its access to the entire material and the constraints of memory, it's still always picking at it's always kind of picking at parts of it. It's never actually really holding the whole thing in an understanding the way that a person does. So that made it easy to not be mystified, or too impressed by them. But it's interesting because my concern almost that I see more is the people that are very opposed to it. the way that they are training themselves to react to these things, like, trying to like, does this have too many M dashes in it? It must be written by AI. I'm going to boycott it or whatever. Like, and it just makes, this is almost a very much of a sci-fi kind of a question, or a theoretical thing to say, like, not that, that, like, I don't know if they would ever become conscious or anything like that, but just, you kind of get into that Blade Runner territory where it's like, if the only difference between a person and a replicant is that one has the label like replicant, but you're going to use that as a means to justify treating them as entirely subhuman or whatever, that's revealing a lot more about you as the person interacting with the AI than anything about the AI as itself. So that's, it's kind of that's just to say, there's seems to be, if there's anybody that seems like they might be AI, it's the people that are constantly talking about why they're against AI, because they just say the same things over and over again.
Well, that one's interesting thing, because that is actually one of the creators I follow was commenting on, like, basically, if you're in like normal and like most people, you can easily find people who agree with you. You don't really need to develop your thinking on stuff that much, but like the weirder you are, the more you need to actually hone your thinking, because, and that also sort of is a double-edged sword, because like a lot of, especially when I was younger, I would come up with arguments that people couldn't really counter, but they were not good arguments. They were just arguments people couldn't understand, so they couldn't counter them, right? And so it took actually meeting people who could understand my arguments and be like, yeah, that's actually a dumb argument, before I could sort of get past that. But in terms of AI, you have sort of you have a few. So do you know the midwit bell curve meme?
Mm-hmm.
Right. So you have, in this one, I think you sort of have 4 levels, because you have like the dumb boomer sort of embracing AI minions memes, right? Like at the very bottom. But then you have the people who are like very anti-AI for very dumb reasons, if anyone actually knows about AI. And then as you learn a little bit about AI, you're like, oh, actually, these are all dumb reasons to object to AI. And I will admit that I actually shared one of those recently when I was talking about sustainability, because I, like, the thing about AI data centers using a lot of water, I believed that was true, just because this is something that comes up a lot with like industrial stuff, is like industrial development often ends up using a lot of water. And because, as I've said, like most of the time, people aren't straight up making up facts. They aren't lying. Most of the time, they're just selectively choosing fact. This one turns it to be a fact that was basically made up. AI data centers don't actually use a lot of water. So I actually fell for that one, although that was not really my reason for opposing AI. That was just my sort of thinking about, in terms of sustainability, like one of the arguments for having infinite growth on a finite planet is that we will go for quality rather than quantity. And that was an example of how I think we're going in the opposite direction of, as we get richer, we tend to make things more disposable, the exact opposite of what you would expect if infinite growth on a finite planet were possible in that dimension. And then you have, but anyway, so you have the dumb arguments against AI, and then you have the people who understand, they're like, yeah, these arguments are dumb, and here's why. And then when you get past it, you have the people who actually understand AI well enough to be like the doomsday scenarios are probably not a concern, but it's still not a good thing, because it is a solution looking for a problem, and it is also an attempt to create both a world that is more of a simulacra and like higher level simulacra, and to create like companies trying to get us dependent on things that we're renting instead of buying. And so all of those, I think, are much more compelling reasons to oppose AI. And in terms of the first one, it's interesting because there's an early Isaac Asimov story, and you know about the whole positronic brain, Asimov, right? So they have the positronic brain with the 3 laws of robotics, right? The top one is you can't harm a human, you must obey humans, and then you must defend yourself unless it conflicts with those first 2 laws. And basically, and the early robots in Asimov, where they were androids, and they were like, and then there's a story where it turns out that androids are developing psychosis because they're basically doing repetitive tasks, and so they reduce them down to just like the arm to do this task. And I think, like I've said, like my New Year's resolution was, and I don't think I'm going to do this, but it is, I wanted to be the place that I could, is I think like if I could get a venture capitalist to give me $20 million, I could do better than like 80% of these AI companies in terms of actually making improvements in these technologies. And that's because I actually am someone I think I could do like revolutionary science in terms of developing it, but also I would be trying to develop models in terms of specific problems that are actually worth solving. And I've talked about that as being barbelling. And I think right now, like the obsession of these companies is still trying to build an AGI. And I feel like, first of all, you're not going to do that using these old models and just more and more computing power. That is just, that's not happening. And second of all, if you could build an AGI, like that is massive overkill for what AI would actually be useful for. And I think if you were trying to actually figure out what problems could AI actually solve usefully, which unfortunately with the motivation of these companies doing it, what's going to be useful for them to solve are not going to be what's useful for like you or me to have them solve, right? But it's still, you might end up getting an AGI out of that, because that I think is how human intelligence evolved, is that it was like solving progressively more problems until we eventually needed to sort of reflect on our own thoughts and our thoughts about others. And that's how sort of human intelligence arose sort of modularly. But it's just the hubris of Silicon Valley. They're not doing that. So I'm like, I think all the alarmist stuff is dumb. And I agree, like Eliezer Yudowski, I have a very low opinion of like the rationalist community in general. Also, when I was up, I pulled, I pulled mysticism. This one's public domain. So this was like company doing print on demand, but they formatted it pretty well. And I got it because it was hardcover, but then I realized, because of course it's print on demand, so it's not, the reason I like hardcovers is because they're sewn in, but it's still like the formatting is good, so I kept it. And it was, and then this is, I thought you might be interested in this because you were talking about you attend a conservative church because liberal churches tend to, my camera is, oh dear, my camera is mirrored, I think.
I can read it. Read it. Yeah. The Psychology of Human Development and the Quest for Meaning, Stages of Faith.
Yeah. And so I haven't read this one, but I've been meaning to. But it is something that I think you sort of notice is you do, as people sort of get more sophisticated, they tend to move away from a more personal God to just very abstract and woo. And I don't know, I don't think I've told you, I'm not sure if I talked about it publicly, but basically like my mother, I talked about it publicly in the comments of some of these Christian channels, but not on my channel. I don't know if I have, is my mother was Catholic and she really didn't like the Catholic Church. And she also was concerned about like cults like the Moonies. And so she was determined to raise me and my brother in a open and affirming church so that we would not become Moonies, to sort of inoculate us against like becoming hardcore like Christian conservatives or like joining a cult later in life, basically was her thinking. And so I was raised at a church that was joint UCC and Unitarian Universalist. And so, of course, the UCC is the most liberal mainline Protestant church, and Unitarian Universalists aren't even Christian at all. And so I very much got this, Jesus is like the first guru and top motivational speaker sort of training. And then when I first encountered young earth creationism, they were defending it in terms of biblical literalism, biblical inerrancy, and sola scriptura. And I couldn't articulate to the people like in my church and to my parents, like, that was the thing that was bothering me, because they were citing Bible verses to support those propositions of how they were like, well, no, you don't have to believe in the Bible. You believe in like young earth creation to believe in the Bible. And like, okay, but they're saying you do because they're these, and I couldn't really articulate that. And so I ended up losing what I thought was faith, but it was sort of, it wasn't really faith. It was just, I thought I believed because parents were telling me, and because there was evidence of magic because of Santa Claus, which I know is, I sincerely, like, I did believe because Santa Claus was proof of magic, God's magic, so God exists. And so I realized in hindsight, that was basically a conflict between like the UCC, they have cut themselves off from their roots in terms of it's no longer necessary to be a Christian to be a member of the UCC, and the Unitarian Universalists even more. But the evangelicals, especially like the young earth creationist type evangelicals, have cut themselves off from their roots in a different way, where they've been like, we just need our reading of the Bible and we don't need any church tradition at all. And so it was basically, for me, that was a conflict between those two, like, they were two versions of Christianity that had cut themselves off from their roots in different ways. And that was sort of what destroyed it for me. But I also, like it didn't help that neither of my parents had, like my father was an agnostic when I was growing up. My mother was, she didn't admit to being an agnostic, but she was. And so like neither of them really believed or had the grounding for me. But it is like I see people, and I, especially people who were raised in these more conservative denominations, and they will tend to often sort of either they will like become atheists and react to be hostile, or they will develop into this very the UCC, like, oh, God is sort of a metaphor type thing. And I think there are stages beyond that, which is why I'm meaning to read it, where you do come back to, yeah, there is a divine, there is a higher power, but it doesn't have the same logic as sort of what you've learned, like traditional religion teaches. But it's also not, like, I initially described myself as pantheism, and I realized that's not accurate. Like, I don't believe like God is literally in everything, but it's more God, like the divine, there is this force that orders the entire universe with something that resembles teleology, and whether it is teleology or not, for our purposes, in humans are limited understanding, I think it makes sense to understand it as teleological. And so I've been meaning to read this because I'm curious, like how it fits into this. But I have a friend actually, same friend who knows Spiral Dynamics, who has had sort of the same complaint you do, because she believes in, she wants a church that believes in like God, but she herself has a more sort of complicated understanding. And so she's sort of, and she's done the opposite, is she's gone to what she called, Spiral Dynamics Green Church. And then she's complaining about them doing these green things where they don't believe in God. So it's trade-off, because there aren't really a lot of religious communities that, at least not formal ones. And for me, the answer for that was Quakerism, because I mean, a lot of Quakers are like green, where it's like God is a metaphor, right? And a lot of others, Quakers, are like traditional Christians. But there are also a lot of people Quakers who are where I am. And because of Quakerism being a very individualistic religion, it allows you to sort of explore this and talk about it with the people. And generally, neither the God is a metaphor, nor the Bible is, the conventional, Nicene Orthodox Christianity people are going to try to argue with you and try to force you to their view. And so, I mean, that was the answer I came up with, but it's not an answer that would work for everyone. Sorry, that was getting way off into the weeds.
Well, yeah, I mean, I don't know, it's so weird. It's because sometimes I will, like, I'll say, like, I will refer to myself as a fundamentalist sometimes, because, I mean, I can say, like, I went to say, like, oh, well, the problem with young Earth creationism is actually they're not taking it literally enough. Well, I could go on a whole thing with that, but like, but then I did essentially, my faith is, there's a couple things. One was an experience which, in retrospect, I realized happened in the middle of an autistic meltdown that I was having, and I was by myself in my basement, and then like I got like this experience of, I encountered Jesus. And it's weird to say, like, oh, I know that was Jesus. And actually the weird thing was, well, we could talk about how you don't like the Beatles, because, well, I don't like John Lennon, but it wasn't John Lennon, but it was Paul McCartney. It was Let It Be had come on, and he's talking about Mother Mary comes to him, and I was like, well, if anything, I should have thought it was Mary, because that was like what was going. But like, I was like, no, I don't know why, but I know it was Jesus. And it stopped to that meltdown, and then like I just had like whatever it says, like in the Bible, the peace that passes all understanding. It did pass all understanding. It was a weird thing where I was like, okay, I had a whole bunch of circumstances in my life that I was depressed about, and now all of a sudden none of those things have changed, but I am absolutely perfectly content and happy. So I'm like, well, that was a miraculous thing. I can't really account for that. And the other thing was, more or less, that my parents actually lived it in a consistent way. And both of my parents had converted as adults, and also through, some more circumstantial, yes, through some exceptional circumstances, that it wasn't merely product of cultural, inheritance or whatever. So, and interestingly enough, like being a more conservative Christian in Massachusetts was, it did kind of give you that minority like persecution boost or whatever, because we were definitely in the minority. So
I was fascinated when I drove out to my grandmother's house in Maine, and I would be going through like the low radio channels. That was where you'd have NPR and college radio, right? And I noticed in Central Mass, suddenly it was all Christian channels. So I think Central Mass is, to the extent New England has a Bible Belt, Central Mass might be part of it.
Maybe so. Yeah. So, but you know, so now though, you know, it's like, it's interesting. Yeah. I mean, but so I don't know. I guess maybe this is even the thing. Maybe it would say like for like in the authentic Christianity or whatever, the way it's supposed to be, you know, on those levels, those like spiral dynamics levels, it's always to be understanding like that the people beneath you are not like to be looked down upon, I guess. And I mean, this is the thing, because many of the people that I've connected to on YouTube and kind of how I ended up got here, it was through like people that had been following Jordan Peterson's early Bible stuff. And a lot of people came like out of evangelicalism into some secular, you know, atheism, and then back into some other form of Christianity, a lot of Catholic or Orthodox or something like that. And, you know, and to me, it was always like, well, I don't think you're really like, you're finished with your journey until you can go back to whatever your parents were at and be like, understanding like that they were, I mean, unless if they were like objectively horrible, but like, you know, at least being able to understand, like, I understand where they were coming from and what they were why they believed what they believed, and, you know, made those things. Like if you haven't gotten there yet, there's more to your journey.
Well, for me, that's basically where I started, because my mother, despite being agnostic, decided again to try to raise us religious, to inoculate us against becoming conservative Christian. And so I ended up, it was interesting because I realized like I still wanted that community and I wanted to have faith, but for 20 years I couldn't find it until I started going to Quaker meeting. And that's when I found I believed in first Quakers and then in a higher power, though not in the like sort of original sort of like sense that I thought I did as a kid, and not in the sense that like most Orthodox Christians, not even like C.S. Lewis do. C.S. Lewis comes closer than any sort of Christian writer I've read, but it's still like a few things. But anyways, and it was interesting because one of the things I ended up exploring there was like, I was like, you know, half my friends were ethnically Jewish, although basically none of them were religiously Jewish. So I knew a lot about Judaism, and I'm like, you know, maybe Judaism makes more sense. And I looked into it and I was like, I want to convert to Judaism, but the problem is I can't believe in Orthodox Judaism, and it seems kind of pointless to convert to Reform or conservative Judaism. Like if you're Jewish and you're Reform or conservative, you're still a Jew, right? But if you're converting to them as like a non-Jew, then you're still like, even you're not really. And so I ended up talking to my mother, and she was like, oh yeah, I was like the same place. I was like considering, it was for different reasons. For her, it was, she really liked the Jewish idea that your legacy is what you leave in this world, as opposed to like anything that happens in the next. And of course, she also had a lot of Jewish friends. Like I was commenting to a friend, like grew up like in Northampton and then Deerfield. So a lot of my mother's friends are lesbians, but like half her non-lesbian friends were Jewish. And a lot of them were like Reformed Jewish. Like her generation, they were like liberal Jewish, and then their kids' generation ended up being ethnically, but like they didn't believe in Judaism, right? So it was like my Jewish friends were ethnically Jewish but didn't believe at all, whereas her Jewish friends believed, but they were Reformed Jewish generally. But she had considered converting, and again, just it didn't quite make sense for her. And so I was like, yeah, and I've had other conversations, but that's one I particularly remember where I'm like, yeah, I sort of ended up in a similar place, even though in my mother's case, she was a lapsed Catholic who like sort of reacted against Catholicism, whereas I had no religious upbringing to rebel against, because she raised me in like the most liberal, nominally Christian denomination she could find. But sorry, I forget where I was going with this.
It's interesting, you know. So actually, this StreamYard account that I use, my friend lets me use it. His channel, so he's Jewish, and if I ever do anything like, because he lets me live stream on his channel if I want and things like that. But if I do, I always have to like make a disclaimer that he does not support the Trinity, and if I choose to talk about that or anything like that. So, you know, but just interesting, you know, that's, another thing we're saying, like, so coming to that place of, so lots of Jewish friends, some Unitarian, not universal, well, actually a lot of Universalist friends, a lot of some Unitarian, non-Universalists, and all other variety of, a lot of people who've converted to Eastern Orthodoxy and Catholicism, but not in the kind of annoying trad way. So, just a lot of interesting people I've met in these spaces. And apparently the little group that I got in was flagged by the guy that does the Christianity on the spectrum as like an autistic sub community or whatever. So, but needless to say, I think most of those people would probably very much benefit from what's, what you're doing on your channel. I think it's a lot of similar things, but coming from different places. So, well, I don't know. We've talked for a long time, so I don't know if you want to wrap things up or anything, or if you had anything else you wanted to talk about, or anything you want to ask me about, or I don't know. But
let's see. Nothing immediately comes to mind. The one thing I wanted to was showing these books, which I grabbed them and I did. So I have, as I've said, like, I just have so many things that I can talk about and I want to talk about, right? That it's always hard to figure out unless someone asks a question like, yeah, I can answer it. So I don't have any particular thing. And I read like a couple of your blog posts, but I don't. A couple of interesting things there. One of them is the phenomenon of like autodidactism, which I'm thinking about a lot, because I never really, like, I am an autodidact, but I never really thought about it as being abnormal until very recently, when I've seen it's mostly been sort of right-leaning channels that have talked about and sort of celebrating, and I want this cult of the autodidact. And for me, it's interesting because I have most of what I learned, I've taught myself. There's also been certain things that I did need. And even though I'm really hostile to like the K-12 education system, and the way we do it now, there are things that I would not have learned on my own. Like, I basically, math and most of my art skills, I needed to learn in a formal setting. And then if I had a good teacher, I would learn things in other subjects. And so math and art were the only two subjects where I actually consistently learned things, whether the teacher was good or not, because they were things that I could not really, aside from geometry, I really could not teach myself math. Some people do. I just didn't have the temperament to do it. And then art, again, like the technical elements of art and the different modalities. But anyway, I don't really have a question on that. I just noticed you were, and that's one of those things I've been thinking about, because to me, it was just, yeah, I am an autodidact, but I didn't think of it as anything normal until I noticed like a lot of these right-leaning channels are sort of valorizing it, partly as like they, like me, have this opposition to the public education system. But I also, again, like from my own experience as an autodidact, I'm like, it's still, I did learn things in even like non-math and non-art subjects when I had a good teacher, even if I don't think the school system alone was worth it. And I learned things in college too, more generally. And then math and art, again, the technical skills, I actually think I needed instruction to get better at those things, at least initially. Sorry, I don't really know if there's anything. That was one thing that I've been thinking about from your blog, because you talked about that a bit, and I've been thinking about that.
Yeah. Well, I just remembered one other thing that I wanted to say, that I did. I appreciated your sentiments on Harry Potter, and I had the same thoughts like when they started getting popular, and I had just started to read some more. I don't know if you ever read any. Raymond Feist was one of the fantasy authors that kind of got, he, as it turns out now that I have more perspective, he's kind of very like middle of the road, but I think it's actually it's a very good baseline, like for understanding things. But even that, I was like, this is better than Harry Potter. Like, I don't understand why people are so obsessed with Harry Potter, but I thought that was interesting that you had made that observation. But I mean, yeah, I do have some more specific thoughts about what I don't like about it, but I mean, I don't know. I guess it was good that it made people want to read. But
I liked the first 4 books. I just thought they were not as good as Ursula Le Guin, not as good as Jane Yolen, not as good as Diana Wynne Jones, not as good as Lloyd Alexander, not as good as Tamara Pierce, and Raymond Feist is an adult fantasy author. Did he write a YA series?
Well, it's not, I don't know if it was really, I mean, I guess, it's just his first book, Magician. It started off as like the characters are all very young, like they're like teenagers. So it, and so I was like, yeah, I started reading it probably when I was like 13, 14. And that's like how the characters are, ages are when you start. So whatever it was specifically rated at, that's it, he started on the right note there.
I, I had a brief period before I got laid off that I was thinking I had this sort of alternate history novel in writing, but it was too literary for the group. And so the only person who really liked it was a guy who kept comparing it to Infinite Jest in a positive way. And so I was thinking, okay, maybe I should try to actually write fantasy. And I had some ideas for how I could do that. And like, I should try to read more fantasy series that people keep talking about. And so I did a bunch of that, and then I got burnt out, and then I learned that I was getting laid off, and I'm like, okay, I'm not going to prioritize trying to write a fantasy series right now anyways. But Raymond Feist was one of the ones who was on my list of people to read, but I didn't get to him before I sort of put that project on pause.
Yeah, I reread a bunch of his stuff later on, and I was like, you know what? This is definitely like entertaining, and it's good, and it's a very, it's funny just because, like, I don't know, I guess maybe like maybe this is a strange neurodivergent like just take, but like there's a lot of like just snobbery, I guess, around like book, booktube culture or whatever. And like to me, like having some, like, it's, I don't know, I feel like having familiarity with something that's so well, everybody will like I guess the people that are obsessed with Tolkien, like I just don't, like, there's no, I don't think there's an original thought to be had about Tolkien. Like, yes, he's influential, but it's just like, read something else. I don't know. So having something that's like, clearly like not as literarily sophisticated, but enjoyable. I don't know. It's good to have a basis of comparison rather than just thinking this is the best and being dismissive of everything, beneath whatever is the best.
So I, like most of my life, I have very much been anti-gatekeeping and, hey, you like what you like, even if I don't like it. Recently, I've sort of started to come around to, I'm not necessarily going to judge you for reading and liking this stuff, but I am going to say, like, it's not helping you. It's like the sort of intellectual equivalent of junk food. And I think Harry Potter is that, where it's basically, I do think the reasons it's popular is the combination of having a, like, everything and the kitchen sink type fantasy is fun, like for children especially, and that it is a sort of neurotypical power fantasy, which, and it's funny because someone was commenting on one of my videos. I still don't read a lot of comments really, but read that one, and they were saying, like, yeah, if you want to be successful, just write power fantasy. I'm like, yeah, I know that, but I just can't, like, that's not compelling to me unless it's like an interesting original power fantasy that has something to say beyond just this is like a wish fulfillment power fantasy. And I feel like that's basically what Harry Potter was for neurotypical people. I also do think a lot of it was, and it's interesting because I did realize sort of after reading like Robert Sapolsky, and I think baboons do this, but chimpanzees definitely do it, is they will only learn things from high status individuals, preferably of the same sex. And so the reason I couldn't get any of my peers to try reading these books I said was better than Harry Potter is because I was a low status member of the class. And so they weren't, and so I do think the fact it was Scholastic pushing it that made it probably more popular than it otherwise might have been organically, which I think probably a lot of, I mean, ultimately, even like who gets published, right, depends on like the gatekeepers to that deciding. So it's not like it's abnormal in that way, but I am at the point now where I'm like, it is like, if it's, you enjoy it, great. I was always frustrated by how people of my generation first would be like comparing everything they didn't like to Voldemort, and then getting so upset when J.K. Rowling came out as being like trans exclusionary, like, and taking it so personally. And I thought both of those things were like just way too invested in this one book series that was not very good. And like, and there was a meme when I was like in college, read another book, because of how many people on generation would only compare everything to Harry Potter. I think at least Lord of the Rings is at least a better series than Harry Potter. And so at least people who are obsessed with Lord of the Rings. There's more there, but it still is like, I agree, like read a better series. And so it's like, I don't want to gatekeep. I don't want to say don't read things you enjoy, but I do like think it is a lot of the stuff that people read is intellectual junk food. And it's part of it is like my like literary taste. Like I want stuff that challenges me and makes me think. And I've even talked about it a bit on my channel. Like there are books that I read like a few years ago that I loved when I read them, but they didn't provoke any thoughts. They didn't make me think. And I went from these are amazing books to like, I would not recommend them, even though they were fantastic reads, just because there's nothing really thought provoking in them. And like ultimately, like they were flawless, but they weren't like worthwhile. And that is like, I keep mentioning my favorite fiction writer is Jack Vance, and I've reread him. Some of his stories, like I've reread 3 times, and everything I've reread at least twice, I think, at least all of his fantasy and science fiction. And something I've realized is a lot of his stories are Horatio Alger stories, where they're well written and thought provoking in terms of how the character sort of gets back to where they deserve to be. And then a lot of his stories actually that are really philosophically interesting, which is why I like writers like that, or why I genuinely like Borges when most people who want to like Borges struggle to get into him, is because a lot of his stories are thought provoking.
Yeah, well, I mean, in my experience, so I have a fiction project that is not, it's not all the way complete. It's outlined all the way. So like I just have to flesh out some of the scenes. So at least I know like it's a coherent story. But like it's interesting how like it's a story that it's like I had to write it to figure out the things that it expresses. And I think that's like the that's what you find invaluable, really really compelling writing. It's something that the person had to write, like to answer their own curiosities or whatever.
That's why I think Blood of My Country is my favorite novel, is because it was like Alan Paton was writing it, and I realized most people who've read it just read it as, oh, it's a book condemning racism in South Africa. And I'm like, no, it's not. Like he was grappling with like a lot of interesting, difficult questions that had no clear answer. And he felt like he needed to write it, and that's what makes it such a compelling novel for me. But then it ends up being, most people still, even people who read it, only sort of see that superficial, because he is condemning racism in South Africa, but that's not why he wrote it. He wrote it because he's trying to, like, he's sort of recognizes everyone is the hero of their own story. Everyone is trying to do the best they can in this world, and it's just the world sucks and it's kind of getting worse. But how can we, especially as we become like deracinated, as we lose our sense of place and connection, and how do we, but can we get back to that to some degree?
Well, I will have to read it then. It sounds, I mean, I've heard of it, but I've not read it. So, Have
you read John Steinbeck? Because I haven't read John, aside from Mice and Men when I was made to, but apparently he was heavily influenced by Steinbeck.
I have not. I think I know. I did read that of Mice and Men, and that was the only one I read. And I read it in high school in like homeschool co-op. Like, actually interesting. It was like the one more liberal mom that was like trying to expose everybody to better literature or something. But but don't I don't know if I don't remember a ton of it. But
I did not like it, and I don't think it was. I don't think that whatever themes were in there were themes that an 8th grader, even like a precocious 8th grader like I was really capable of getting. I think my 8th grade teacher assigned it because she tended to both overestimate what children were capable of, and because it's a short book.
Yeah, I don't know. That just saying that reminds me. I don't know. Have you read the Yearling? Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings.
Sounds familiar. It might have been because I read so many books in middle school and late elementary school that were kind of unmemorable to me that I think I saw it. I don't know if I read it, but I don't remember anything about it if I read it.
Well, it's interesting because I had not read it it's interesting because I read, so there was another author who I like, who he had a nonfiction book that he wrote, and he talked about, he had written he's a songwriter and an author, and he had written a song, based on his reading of it, and he talked about it in the book, and he had read it. He had a really complicated relationship with it because he grew up, like, actually he moved to the town that it takes place in Florida, like halfway through his childhood, and it was this whole, and so he was like, I don't want to read that book, I don't care about it. And then he ended up reading it when he's like 40 years old and a father, and it's because it's a story of like a young boy, like they assign it as like middle school reading material or whatever. But he was saying, but so then I read it as a 40-year-old father and realizing, like, how the heck is any like 12-year-old kid gonna like get this? Like, whatever they're getting out of it is not like it is something that you need to have life experience to really grasp. So it's funny because I wonder how much the case is with a lot of that stuff that's assigned reading in school, and then people don't get it, and then they say, what's the point of signing these books? And so now they don't even assign them anymore. But
it's interesting because Ursula Le Guin, Wizard of Earthsea, was what introduced me to YA fantasy, and it was the hardest book like series I'd ever read up until that point. And later someone said, oh, it was young adult, and I heard it as adult, and I'm like, oh, that's why. And then I learned, no, it was young adult, and I had learned that was the concept at that point. So it was written for young adults, but she had refused to dumb down her language at all. And so in writing it for young adults, what she changed was she tried to write only themes that she was confident young adults would understand, but she kept the language being sophisticated. And I'm glad she did, because it was still an enjoyable read, even though it challenged me. And it's interesting because I have met like grown adults who say they can't read her language now. And so, whereas I struggled with it when I was 11, but now I get it. And so I think, looking back, I think she had the right idea of don't dumb down your language because the kids will learn from it, but do try to write a story that the kids will relate to, but also like don't treat the kids like kids can understand complicated things, but it is, like you said, they needs to be things that are within their life experience. And I think part of the problem with books like Of Mice and Men is probably that it's depending on life experience stuff that children just don't have a frame of reference for.
Well, and I think probably that's I mean, even thinking about like kind of that whole spiral dynamic thing, I think there's probably something about like the best stories or whatever that you can communicate on all those levels, or that you can grasp it at the lower levels, but the meaning, one would say this maybe about like Jesus parables and things like that, that there is a consistent meaning that just goes deeper, and probably the same with a lot of other kind of like folk tales and myths and things like that. But yeah, definitely it's harder for normal people to write those ways, I think. But
that actually, I love Idries Shah, and especially his book Reflections. And one of the things that he talks about is people have a tendency to think that mistake ideas as being profound, or because you can elaborate on them a lot, even if they're not that profound or useful. Whereas ideas that can be elaborated on and are useful, but don't sound profound to them. I'm forgetting, it was a very pithy thing that I am completely butchering, trying to remember what it was, but basically you'll have some things that people will dismiss as trite that actually have seriously like developmental potential. Like one that I keep pointing to is the Serenity Prayer, which people dismiss as, oh, this is like the thing that grandma has on her pillow, right? But it's but it is a deeply useful idea that gets way deeper than what people think. Whereas then there are other things that people will like to cite as if they're profound, but they're actually, if anything, they're like thought-stopping cliches. And sorry, that was related to something you were saying, but I forget what I was responding to now.
Well, I was just talking about how those most profound stories or whatever, they should be able to kind of maintain meaning even as as you advance, or you can keep getting something out of them.
Yeah, and like Aesop's fables, like I've seen people dismiss them as, oh, that's for children. I'm like, no, the ideas behind Aesop's fables are profound. The issue is that when they were translated into English, they started tacking on explicit morals that I think destroy or hide a lot of the potential nuance. And I remember there's one in particular that I always confused me, because most versions of Aesop's fables that had it didn't have a moral, and the one that had a moral was dumb. And that's the one of the man and the satyr. Do you know that one?
Is that the one where he blows on the soup or whatever and
Yeah.
warms his hands? Is that yeah with
And
the same breath?
Yeah. So it's he's the man is like taking in from like a storm by a satyr. And so first he blows on his hands, and the satyr asks, "Why are you doing?" He's like, "Well, I'm warming my hands." And then the satyr gives him soup, and he's blowing on it. He say, "Why are you doing that?" And he's saying it's to cool it off. And the satyr kicks him out, because he's like, "Well, I can't trust a man who, warms and cools with the same breath." And that was confusing to me as a kid. And the one version of Aesop fables that had a moral said like don't be inconstant or something, like consistency is like a virtue. And what I realize now is I am almost certain that was a criticism of the satyr and of people like that who don't understand that like the same thing can have different effects in different contexts. But the simplified moral, that one that tried to do it completely got it wrong. And and then the others didn't even bother trying to do a moral because they couldn't make sense of it. And so that bothered me so much as a kid. And now I'm realizing, it actually makes complete sense. It was just the way that it was presented sort of oversimplified it. And similarly with like the tortoise and the hare, because the moral was always given as slow and steady wins the race. I've always been like, well, I'm the hare and I need to be the tortoise. But what I've realized is I'm someone like, I don't do like a grind of a little of the same bunch of different same things every day like I was taught you're supposed to do. But that's not a healthy way to do things. But I actually am someone like I keep at stuff and I'm consistent about it. And I tend to sort of front load my effort such that I will seem to be making no progress. And then I'm never going to be, although when I was a kid, I fantasized about, the Joan Baez song Diamonds and Rust, where she says, like Bob Dylan, you burst onto the scene already a legend. I fantasize being that. I'm never going to be quite on that level, but I do sort of come into things new, often seeming like in being more prepared than a lot of people, because I've done this front loading, like before I actually got to it, or like this sort of prep, but with slow and steady wins the race. And it doesn't actually say like, do a little bit of everything consistently every day, but that was very much like the indoctrination they give us in the schools, right? And so that was how I interpreted it. And so the combination of that explicit moral and the culture of this is how you make progress screwed me up and kept me back compared to if I had been allowed to follow my own patterns.
Yeah, because, it's interesting because I don't know, I guess that's the combination of like with ADD and autism, you have you're super focused on the special interest sign, kind of, this is how it feels like to me. And then it's like, I want to get until like I can see the finish line. And then I'm like, okay, I can see that there's a finish line. So now I'm not interested anymore.
Yeah.
And then, the learned discipline is helpful to say, okay, the finish line is right there. Just keep going until you finish. But the point is that, if you don't allow yourself to just focus on that one thing, it'll just sort of keep coming back at like, or what, it's an annoying thing that you want to figure out, but you have something else to do or whatever, you can, it is maybe focusing on one thing until you get it all the way done. And then you can move on to something else. That's the ADHD way, I think, to succeed.
Although I do suspect ADHD and is not really two things. My kind of intuition is there's different kinds of autism. There's at least two different kinds of ADHD. And so hyperactive impulsive ADHD seems to be more associated with bipolar and BPD. And the inattentive ADHD seems to be more closely associated with certain forms of autism. And so I'll see like I relate well to like inattentive ADHD people who aren't diagnosed with autism. They often have sort of autistic traits. And there are autistic people who aren't diagnosed with ADHD, but still have traits I can relate to. But there's also autistic people I just can't relate to. And that they tend to be the more stereotypical ones of, and as like, I was diagnosed with autism first at 10 at a time when really most people like me were either diagnosed with ADHD or diagnosed with nothing as kids. But the thing is, I had no ADHD related issues in school. So my first issue in school was I had a 5th grade teacher who would give assignments that had a literal meaning and a common sense meaning. And I would do the I'd do the literal meaning, and she'd be, don't be a smart aleck, use your common sense. And I'd be like, I only see the one meaning. And that ended up being how I got diagnosed with autism. And so I was then in with these people who were much more like stereotypically autistic. They had 2 or 3 interests, like hyperfixations, that they really had nothing beyond. And they were the ones who, like I've talked about, like people use detail-oriented differently. And people, like when people say I'm detail-oriented, they mean like I'm seeing like wrinkles and facets and things that people won't see. But when people say autistic people are detail-oriented, or I want someone who's good at detail, they generally mean I want someone who is good at grinding detail-oriented implementation work without making mistakes, which as someone with ADHD, I am absolutely terrible at that. And I can like read my blog posts like a half dozen times and I'll still find typos, right? I can read it like 6 days in a row and I'll still find typos when I come back to it a week later, right? And part of it is I'm using speech to text, but even when I type with my hands. But anyway, so I do think like my feeling is that inattentive ADHD, ADHD, and some people get diagnosed with autism but wouldn't quite meet the ADHD criteria are one thing. The autistic people who really are great at the grinding detail-oriented stuff and have like the 1 or 2 very narrow hyperfixations are another thing. The hyperactive impulsive ADHD is another thing, and there might be others. And that these diagnoses are just, I mean, they're labels, they're categories for the ways that the underlying tendencies manifest as impairments.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. Yeah, I've had a lot of problems. Well, it's just difficult to communicate, even because on the one hand, it's like the important thing to note the important thing to figure out is what kind of neurological, architecture somebody's dealing with. Yep. But the labeling is entirely based on symptoms of, usually that are derived from long exposure to a mismatched environment. So, it's, there's a problematic, it is a very different thing, because, and some people hate the like neurodivergent label or whatever, because the people that are too pro, the like the successful people that are working in Silicon Valley or whatever, and are complaining about not getting accommodations, but they're clearly have achieved a level of success that does not jive with the kind of victim mentality. So yeah. I can see how all the terms always get just their usefulness tends to wane in time. Yeah. Well, this was all really great. I think potentially maybe talk more. I don't know. Maybe we'll have to have another talk about figuring out business stuff or something, maybe behind the scenes or whatever, because that's certainly something I would like to, help other people figure out, and especially because I know you've been looking into the publishing thing, and I already have 2. I just did everything through KDP, but I know there's better ways to do that. And really, how do we get like, how do people like you and I get a neurotypical front person to be enthusiastic about the ideas and pitch them to the masses?
I'm not even sure that's necessary, because I do think what I'm realizing is like I've realized basically I could probably never be a writer, but I could maybe be a writer's writer. I think I talked about that in my video on Ursula. But like that is, so there's never going to have the same number of sales, but the people who are interested in that like are going to spend more on it. Like I am someone, like I read a lot of writers, and I buy a lot of books in a way that a lot of the more popular writers may not have that. And then people will pay more. And like I come back to Jack Vance, because Jack Vance is incredibly popular with like the Silicon Valley Tech Bro set. And so his hardcover versions of his books never, like they're always short print runs. And then immediately after they sell out, they start going for a lot of money, because all the tech bros are like competing to bid them up, right? Because the people who like Jack Vance tend to be, there's enough of them who are highly successful. And so I think like I don't have to appeal to neurotypicals. I just have to appeal to people who are a little bit less weird than I am, and consequently a little bit more successful than I am, I think.
Well, one of my goals is, to have more of a, I don't know, to make the community aspect a little bit easier for everything. So I do have a little more of a vested interest in that, in rather than, I don't know. I mean, I guess that's maybe just one of those things, where it's like I've seen, there's a problematic aspect to starting your own tribe or whatever. I don't know. I guess this is kind of one of the things where it's like I think about like in Christianity and Jesus, like telling the apostles like to feed my sheep, and to be like realizing like there are these maybe in some sense, at this current moment in time, the neurodivergent person sees, is kind of the outcast or whatever, but they're also the ones who end up shaping a lot of the social mechanisms and things that, I mean, like you wouldn't have the internet if it wasn't for neurodivergent people. And I mean, it's almost like the difficulty of connecting inspires these new tools and apparatuses, which then kind of get co-opted and lose their usefulness. But
I think basically people tend to think about problems up to the point that they like feel like they're adequately solved, or until they hit the limits of their capacity to solve them. And so some people, they're just unfortunately dumb, and their life sucks, but they cannot solve their own problems at all. But then for other people, it ends up being like neurotypical people generally have limited curiosity because they don't need to, because the world is made for them. And I mean, now it's sort of, we've made it to be less friendly, but it's not hostile enough. Like it works well enough that they generally don't need to question it. And then people who are like a little bit weirder need to question things a little bit more. And those are the people who tend to be the most successful, because they're still accessible to neurotypical people, and they can sort of solve neurotypical problems because they think about it a little bit more. And then for people like me, I mentioned, I don't know if I mentioned this publicly, but I've noticed I don't fit in with groups of people with groups of outcasts, and I barely feel comfortable with most groups of people who don't fit in with the groups of outcasts, right? Like I'm at 3 levels removed from normal, basically. And so I end up thinking about it more, and of course I have the ability, and so someone who is weird but can't think on it more is just going to be stuck. But then someone who, so I think talk about solving these problems, it's because when you have both the means and the motivation, that is when you start trying to solve the things that other people just accept as facts of life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I do think, this is one of my friend Daniel's big contentions, is that, well, he's basically saying everybody is an existentialist now, because really, except maybe in very small local environments, the kind of the social givens or whatever, there is not a uniform culture. It's continuously fragmenting, so everybody is having to deal with more need to understand their neighbor in a more direct, propositional, linguistic way, rather than just shared vibes or whatever normal people kind of do, I guess. So it's the good skill set for people like you and I too. I think that, and that is even what what I've everything where I've written and saying I tend to write these long blogs. It's because I'm trying to externalize the thinking to make sure that it makes sense from the ground up, in the hopes somebody else can find it and follow it. It's always like, this is the thing that if I could have just read this, I wouldn't have had to write it. But that's why I put it out there for someone else.
And that's what I was at Yellow and Grasping at Turquoise. I have a blog that I don't link to, that I did a few dozen posts on before my current one, and that was full of posts like that, and then even more full of drafts that were so long and I couldn't finish them. I couldn't figure out how to wrap them up. And so doing this blog was, I have a few long posts, but it's figuring out how to get shorter has been critical. And so it's definitely worth doing if you can. For me, it was hard just because I had a hard time finishing most of the things that I write that long. And so generally it's easier if I can write an entire post in one sitting, because then I'm like, okay, this is the essential stuff. Whereas then if I come back to it, then I'm like, oh, I thought of more stuff, and then more, and then it just keeps growing.
Yeah. Well, that's what, this was like a year and a half of trying to write a blog about the current thing, and then the current moment passed, and then I hadn't finished writing it, and so then sitting on a bunch of kind of essays that once they did wrap up, hey, it comes together pretty good, and I even like that one. I titled it the subtitle "Rough Drafts on Cultures That Last," because is a economics and architecture and a lot of stuff about stories and various things, but to me, like, I don't know, maybe that's even the thing, is like, I was like, I would value that is the sort of thing that tends to be put in rough draft, but maybe there's more use now for people to see the work in progress, or whatever, to see the flow, rather than just getting the finished product and then you wonder how did the person get there, or whatever, So well, and maybe that's just even an autistic notion of you pushing back on the appeal to authority, or whatever, like so and so wrote a book, so they're an authority, and that's how we know that they're right, because they wrote it in a book. But well, this has been a fun conversation. Glad we could connect. We'll hopefully do it again sometime, and send I will send whatever meager viewers show up to this over to your channel to check it out. But definitely appreciate what you're doing. So, and
when you release it, I'll do a post to my blog, and I'll put it also on my playlist for interviews. Which
okay, yeah, and I can put the little collab link in there or whatever. So, all right, well, thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it.
It was nice meeting you, and I like video meeting you, right? And nice talking to you. And talk again soon, maybe. Have a good day.
All right, you too.
Bye.